So today we're looking at Japanese maples that are great for small spaces, even planted in the ground, unlike this one, or indeed with a growing habit that's really conducive to growing in a smaller garden or under other trees. Hi there maple fans, and in this series of videos I'll be sharing what I do throughout an entire year on a monthly basis. Please note that these months are based on UK timings, but of course can easily be adapted to anywhere else in the world. So this is my garden a few years ago. Lovely to see online how popular Japanese maples are becoming, but it's a very addictive habit and you can end up with quite a few like this, to be honest with you. So perhaps buying the right one is absolutely critical. Many of them are at garden centres and stuff like that. We buy on impulse, totally understand that. I've done it myself. But a year or two down the line and my garden's completely changed now and I've got lots and lots of different trees. So if I do want to plant some in the ground, what would I do is the question. Or should I leave them in pots? So the biggest tree I have by far is about the same age as most of the other ones, and that's that Orange Dream, and in the ground it certainly grows to a much bigger size. So here we have a lovely little dwarf maple, and the first thing to say is it's quite sad really, because the garden centres won't stock many of these trees because they're dwarf and they don't grow very quickly, so they can't turn a quick profit on them. But absolutely gorgeous. Went to a sort of dedicated Acer supplier for these, and it's really worth it because it's so cute and the little leaves are absolutely tiny. So these dwarves also make great sort of trees for bonsai as well, because it looks like a sort of miniature tree, and that's exactly what it is. So absolutely fantastic. Slow growing. So some of these dwarf trees will actually put on growth quite quickly initially, then slow down. This one's slow right from the get-go. So in 10 years, and that's as good a way to measure these as any, you're probably looking at 1.5 meters across by 1.5 meters tall, something like that. So very, very manageable. So here we've got Mikawa Yatsubusa, which is a fantastic tree. And this is an interesting one because, again, it just grows really slowly right from the start. So a tree like that is probably about 6 years old, and you know, you might see it and it's quite expensive for what it is in terms of its size. But as you can see, it's actually growing a ton of foliage that for many other trees, it would be like many, many feet tall. But because it's so compacted together and so dense, it grows really, really slowly. So a good idea with these dwarf ones, if you see any at the right price, to buy them early, because you know you're going to save an awful lot of money buying one later at quite a large price really. Again, you're not going to find those in garden centres because it's going to take them 6 years to get the money back. So another interesting fact that I only realised when I'm making the video actually was the first 2 trees I've shown you are both really sun tolerant, and here's another one. I think a good tip here is that these trees don't like too much water. It's good general advice not to overwater them because their metabolism's slower, they're slower growing. They won't need quite as much, so certainly don't let them get really dry. But certainly in the spring and the autumn, it's just good to monitor water very carefully on these, even more than most maples. None of them like wet roots, we know that. And also in terms of pot sizes, you know, keep them to a sensible size for that bit longer, to be honest with you, because that will always help with the water levels. So what's lovely about Rhode Island Red is the fact that it's like a miniature bloodgood really. So if you like the colour of bloodgood, I actually prefer the shape. It's a bit sort of denser foliage really. But what you'll find with this is in about 10 years, it'll be about 10 feet tall, which is reasonable, to be honest with you. I mean, that's probably nearly 7 foot tall, the bloodgood behind it already, and that's in a pot. So in the ground to be 10 foot tall in 10 years, I think it's very reasonable indeed. So next we have Murasaki Kohime, and it's quite like in the leaf structure actually, particularly in the spring, Kohime or Little Princess, but they spread out very, very wide. This one will land up in 10 years about 1.2 meters tall, and probably 1.5 meters wide, something like that. So it's much more of a shrubby sort of ball shape, and you know, therefore much more manageable. You can sort of just about see the new growth there. That looks a bit more like Little Princess that I've got. This tree is a fairly new one. I've got it fairly recently, so you know, we'll grow that on a little bit, but it looks absolutely fantastic, to be honest with you. And again, it's come from a nursery that grows these outdoors, so it's quite hardened off. And this is really a good example of where research is key, because to start with they just all look pretty similar, but it's a bit like buying conifers. You know, they all look the same to start with in the garden centres, but is it a lowlandi that's going to be 30 feet tall in no time, or is it sort of something quite small really? So next we have Carll's Corner, which is a lovely dwarf. Again, really slow growing. This is about 4 years old according to the grower, which is remarkable. Would be absolutely brilliant for bonsai, and probably in 10 years only land up about 4 feet tall in the ground. Now, of course, if you want to keep these in pots, it's going to inhibit the growth even more, especially in the correct small size pot. So therefore, that could be on a patio, it could be absolutely anywhere. And of course, with these dwarf trees as well, you can always put them underneath other trees and planted out in the ground. That's going to look brilliant. And just rather than looking at the sort of the trunk of other trees, you've got something to plant in front of them that's not going to cause too many problems, really. But also just saying, passing as well, really, that I'd always keep trees in pots for at least a couple of years, so that you can harden them off, because you can sort of move them into more sun. If you bought them late in the season from a nursery, it's been in the polytunnel all year, it'd really benefit from sort of being out from spring next year to kind of harden it off a lot, really. And it just means that you get to know the tree and what it likes. So it's definitely worth going to proper nurseries and finding some nice trees that really suit you. These dwarf ones will not cause problems in years to come in the ground, whereas I constantly see online people saying my tree's got too big, I don't know what to do with it. And then if it's a fast growing tree anyway and it's in the ground, you're just going to be fighting it forever. Whereas a little fella like this one here looks lovely, and it's going to be, your nature's on your side. So it's going to be slow growing. It's going to be sort of 1.5 meters tall or something like that in 10 years. And for those of you that, don't want to leave their trees in pots, because after a year in the ground or so, you can pretty much leave these trees to their own, to be honest, as long as the ground's well prepared. You'll have to look at your soil type, of course, and make sure there's plenty of drainage. But my orange dream I showed you earlier is absolutely fine. I do nothing with it whatsoever the whole season, and it just carries on under its own steam, really. So this is a great way of having a sort of Japanese maple garden, or some Japanese maple trees at the very least, that are just going to be self-managing, and you're not going to have to worry about too much, especially if you like going on holidays and stuff like that, really. So now we're going to come on to Shaina, which is a gorgeous little tree. It really, really is. Like some of these other trees, they're witches' brooms, which means they're sort of found growing on other trees. And this little fella here produces the most gorgeous red new growth on its sort of darker crimson red older growth, which is just fantastic. Difficult to recommend this one though, just showing the nubbed leaf in the middle there, which is a sort of sign of many, many witches' brooms, to be honest with you. But this one's a bit hard to recommend, because I know growers actually that won't stock it because it sort of kills over and dies in a few years. However, I think in a pot where you've got much more control of water levels and stuff like that, it does better, believe it or not. I even know one arboretum where actually there's just a sign for this. It was planted out in the ground, and the only thing that's left is the sign, which is really, really sad. But I think in a pot, if you manage it carefully, I think it's a lovely little tree, to be honest, and very, very sun tolerant. So the beauty of Shaina and Wilson's Pink Dwarf, which we've got here actually, is they both grow fairly quickly to start with, but I've seen both of these, 10, 15 years old plus, and they're only about 6 feet tall, something like that. So they grow okay to start with, get some lovely new growth on, which on this Pink Dwarf sort of shows you why, because it is a pink colour. So there's nice sort of summer interest on this, which is lovely, but it'll sort of put a bit of a growth on in the first year or two, and then settle out to be a really, really nice size, to be honest with you, and very, very manageable. So even in a pot here, it's growing quite well, which is surprising. So again, you can't sort of judge a book by its cover. If you see this in a garden centre, they'll probably want quite a lot of money for it, because it's a few years old now. And just to say, if you'd like to come with me on my Acer journey, please do like and subscribe to my little channel. It really, really helps. I've also recently set up a Patreon site, so that's a great way of supporting me too, and help out with some of the costs of my excursions, really. There's also the offer of some personal help, if you'd like it, either in a group format or on a one-to-one basis. So just to move tack slightly here, because if you're short of space, there's another way to go. Many gardens are quite tight, but the vertical space is almost infinite, and there's no problem in the UK at least with growing sort of things tall over fences as long as they're growing. So this is Okushimo, and as you can see here, it's got a really, really upright growing habit. So that's already in about 3 years, about my chest height, which is probably about 4.5 feet, something like that. The leaves are absolutely gorgeous. They're kind of curled over, which is very, very interesting. And this cultivar is over 300 years old. So there's a bit of history to sort of to it as well, really, sort of come from Japan. But just an interesting thought. I mean, you say you might not have the sort of space width-wise, but what about having something that's going to grow in a column? There's not many column acers, but that's very clearly is. And that's just followed up by Twombly's Red Sentinel, which is a terrific tree. It's a bit sort of bloodgood-like, but incredibly vertical in nature. So that one's a few years old now, actually, and it just gets a very dense amount of foliage, which I really enjoy too. And as you can see, the leaders sort of just go straight up. So yes, it will spread to some degree, but as you can see there, that one's grown out sideways and gone straight up again. So it's a really handy tree to kind of leave to its own devices, really. It will just get very tall but not very wide. And I've even heard tale of these being used as sort of hedging and stuff like that, because you plant loads together, they're all going to go straight up and not sort of interfere with each other horizontally. And you could have a really nice sort of strange hedge. There won't be any leaves on it in the winter, of course, because it's deciduous, but during the summer, I'm sure it'd look absolutely lovely. So as it happens, I've got a picture of that tree from 3 years ago. So just be clear that Okushimo and Twombly's are both full-grown trees. This would get 30 feet tall in many years, but because of its vertical habit, it's very versatile. So another sort of class of tree that would be really handy for, you know, those with limited space are these weeping ones, because it's already at its final height. It's just going to weep down from there. Now you can actually keep staking the leaders up and sort of make it taller and taller if you wanted to, but allowed to weep down like this, I mean, it's really handy, because if you put that under a window or something like that, it's not going to grow and obscure your view out the window, obviously. So that's a really nice feature of these trees. And actually, if you've got a bit of height, and it'll weep down below the level of the pot that you put it in. So that could be really nice to sort of cover up some wall or wood here of, you know, whatever you've got really, and just to make things rather interesting. So that was Ryusen, which is amazingly sun tolerant, and this Cascade Ruby is the same. So if you put it into shade, they'll both be quite green actually, but you've got this facility to put them into some sun, which I've done not that recently with this one. But sometimes, you know, it's rather confusing why it's called Ruby if it's completely green. But honestly, you know, the more sun I've given it, it seems to really thrive on it. It's actually grown loads since I put it out in sun as well. So, you know, I've done other videos on this, I mean, worth checking out. But in terms of space and being able to sort of modify it as required, I think this is one really easy to manage. If it grows down too low, you can trim the ends of the branches off if you wanted to. They're very sort of thin and spindly anyway. It's not really going to damage the tree. Or indeed, I've got Dragon Master here, which is kind of a variant on Orange Dream. Got it in loads of shade because Orange Dream is kind of the same really, like shade. But unusually, because I've got it low grafted, which I had to ask my Acer supplier or one of my Acer suppliers especially for, it's going to weep down from a height above. So again, it's a way of using the space effectively, if you see what I mean. I mean, eventually that would reach right down to the ground, which would be kind of interesting, I suppose. So definitely worth thinking about your garden vertically as well as horizontally, because those bare walls could be filled up. You could put pots under other trees as well to give them more height, to kind of make things more interesting, or even construct something like borders like I've done here to give some height really. So another type of tree that could be great for smaller spaces are the Dissectum varieties. So some of these can go reasonably large, but many don't really. I've seen examples of this Crimson Queen 20-25 years old, which aren't massively bigger than this. They sort of get to a size and weep down, which makes it sort of fairly easy to manage. And perhaps for those circumstances where, you know, height's a problem, because again, you've got it under windows and things like that, one of those will get to a reasonable height, start weeping down and not take up a vast amount of space really. So again, there's something for everyone, and it's just worth looking out for. So Crimson Queen, lovely tree, quite readily available, to be honest with you. This is Schwartz, which again is readily available. And it's not a huge tree. So some of these non-dwarf trees are actually not that big either. So I bought this about 3 years ago. It's put on a little bit of growth, but it's kind of slowed down immensely, really. So, you know, there's bonsai maples that people can develop, or there's extremely large trees that are 30-40 feet tall, but there's also everything in the middle. So again, it's really worth just thinking about it and investing in the right tree that's going to suit you. Likewise with butterfly hair, which is absolutely gorgeous, easy to get hold of. You can even buy really cheap ones that aren't grafted, which if you're really careful with, they can do okay. It seems to not get much bigger, it just gets bushier. So there are a few outlying branches, but again, I've seen these 20, 30 years old. They're not a crazy size at all, to be honest with you. And it's a reasonably sort of upright situation. It doesn't spread everywhere sideways, because there's some lovely trees out there, but they have a habit of doing that.